The college lecture hall buzzed with the usual energy of a mid-morning class. Students were chatting in low voices, flipping through well-worn notebooks, or absent-mindedly scrolling on their phones while waiting for the professor to arrive. Among them, seated in the middle rows, was Matthew Cole. He looked slightly out of place, not because of how he dressed, but because of the quiet strength in his presence. At 32 years old, Matthew was older than most of the other students. His short-cropped hair and weathered features hinted at a life lived far from the sterile world of academia. A simple gray t-shirt stretched over broad shoulders, and his jeans were clean but faded. He sat upright, hands resting calmly on the desk, eyes quietly observing the room. Unlike the others around him, Matthew wasn't nervous. He had seen things in his life that few of his classmates could ever imagine. For 12 years, he had served as a Marine, deployed to war zones where danger lurked behind every corner. He had led men through harrowing missions and endured hardships that tested every fiber of his being. Now, back home, he had decided to rebuild his life in a new direction. Earning a degree was his first step toward that goal. As the clock struck 10, the door swung open. The sound of high heels tapping against the tiled floor drew the students' attention toward the front of the room. Professor Evelyn Hart entered, carrying an air of authority that seemed to press down on everyone. She was in her mid-40s, with sharp features and steel-gray eyes that missed nothing. Every movement was precise, deliberate. Dressed in a tailored navy blazer and pencil skirt, she exuded professionalism. Professor Hart had a reputation, one that made even the most confident students uneasy. Her grading was notoriously strict, and her lectures unforgiving. But it wasn't just her academic rigor that set her apart. It was her tendency to dismiss students she believed were unworthy of higher education. She made no secret of it. As she approached the lectern, her gaze swept the room with practiced efficiency. Then she saw Matthew. For a moment, her expression shifted, curiosity flitting across her features before a smirk tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Well," she said, her voice smooth but edged with condescension, "it appears we have a new student, and an older one at that." The room fell silent. A few students exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others smirked behind their hands. Matthew held her gaze, his expression unreadable. He didn't flinch. Professor Hart crossed her arms, the smirk widening slightly. "I suppose it's never too late to learn, though I do hope you can keep up. This class isn't a remedial program." Some students chuckled quietly. Others shifted in their seats, unsure of how to react. Matthew simply nodded, showing no sign of irritation. He had faced far worse than the judgmental gaze of a college professor. What Professor Hart didn't realize was that Matthew Cole hadn't come here merely to learn. He had come to teach her a lesson, one she wouldn't forget. The early days. As the semester progressed, Professor Hart continued to single him out. Her comments were subtle at first, disguised as offhand remarks, but they gradually escalated. "Isn't it nice," she mused during one lecture, "that some people get a little extra time to figure out what they really want to do? Although I suppose someone like Mr. Cole probably already knows. After all, military life doesn't leave much room for personal growth, does it?" The class went silent. All eyes darted toward Matthew, who sat motionless, his attention fixed on the lecture notes in front of him. He didn't look up, didn't react. Professor Hart's lips tightened. She wasn't used to being ignored. "Come on, Mr. Cole," she said in a syrupy tone. "Tell us, what exactly are you hoping to get out of this degree? Planning on a nice, quiet office job?" Her words hung in the air like knives. A few students laughed nervously. Matthew slowly raised his hand. The room grew even quieter, everyone holding their breath. "Yes, Mr. Cole," Professor Hart asked, her tone laced with false politeness. "I'm here to learn," Matthew said plainly. His voice was calm and steady, offering no hint of anger or resentment. For a moment, something flickered behind Professor Hart's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or annoyance. She cleared her throat and moved on with the lecture, but her gaze lingered on him longer than necessary. The challenge. By mid-semester, Professor Hart's scrutiny had intensified. She called on Matthew more frequently than any other student, often posing complex questions without warning. One day, she asked the class to compare authoritarianism and democracy. Silence followed. Students shuffled in their seats, flipping through notes, hesitant to speak. "Mr. Cole," Professor Hart called sweetly. "Why don't you enlighten us?" Matthew inhaled slowly. Authoritarianism concentrates power in the hands of one or a few individuals, restricting personal freedoms and limiting political participation, he answered evenly. Democracy, on the other hand, is built on citizen participation, with free and fair elections giving people a voice in government. There was a pause. "Well," Professor Hart said, her tone dismissive, "that was a very basic answer. I would expect a bit more depth from someone your age." Students shifted uncomfortably. Matthew felt the heat rise in his cheeks, but refused to let it show. He simply nodded and returned to his notes. The worst, however, came during the group project. Professor Hart assigned groups at random, or so it seemed. She paired Matthew with 3 younger students who, from the outset, treated him like an outsider. One of them, a sharp-tongued girl named Zoe, rolled her eyes whenever he spoke. "You're just here to make up the numbers, aren't you?" she sneered during one meeting. "You're probably used to following orders, not thinking for yourself." Matthew bit back his frustration. He had worked with difficult people before, but as deadlines approached and the group floundered, his patience wore thin. Zoe and her friends ignored his suggestions, and their project fell apart. On presentation day, Zoe stumbled through their half-finished work. Professor Hart watched, her expression unreadable, but her silence was ominous. "Well," she said coldly after the presentation ended. "That was disappointing." Her gaze landed on Zoe. "You were the group leader. You should have done better." Before Zoe could respond, Matthew spoke. "Professor Hart," he said quietly but firmly, "I take responsibility." The room hushed. "The failure wasn't due to one person," he continued. "It happened because we didn't function as a team. I should have spoken up sooner." Zoe's face turned bright red. Professor Hart's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing for a moment. Then, surprisingly, she nodded. "I'll take your point into consideration, Mr. Cole." It was the first time her voice lacked mockery. The shift. Something changed after that day. Professor Hart no longer targeted Matthew with biting comments. Her tone softened, becoming more neutral. She still held everyone to high standards, but the personal jabs disappeared. During the next exam, as she walked the rows, she stopped by Matthew's desk. She glanced at his answers before speaking softly. "I trust you're doing well, Mr. Cole." Matthew met her gaze. "Yes, Professor." She nodded and moved on. It was a small exchange, but it felt significant. An unexpected apology. The final weeks of the semester were quieter. Matthew continued to study diligently, no longer weighed down by Professor Hart's disapproval. The morning of the final exam, he arrived early. As he reviewed his notes, Professor Hart entered, more composed than ever. She handed out test papers and paused briefly at his desk. "You've come a long way," she murmured, her tone thoughtful. Matthew didn't answer. He didn't need to. After the exam, as he gathered his things, Professor Hart approached him again. For once, she seemed hesitant. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I owe you an apology." Matthew blinked. Of all the things he expected, that wasn't one of them. "I underestimated you," she continued. "I was wrong. Your dedication, it's admirable." He nodded slowly. "Thank you, Professor. You're not just here to learn," she added softly. "You taught me something, too." The conclusion. When grades were posted, Matthew found his name and saw the A beside it. But it wasn't just the grade that mattered. Beneath it, Professor Hart had written a note. "Resilience and respect go a long way. Keep moving forward." On the final day of class, as students filed out, Professor Hart asked to speak with him once more. "You've reminded me that teaching isn't just about grading papers," she said. "It's about recognizing strength in all its forms." Matthew smiled faintly. "We've both learned something then." As he left the classroom, the weight he had carried for so long seemed lighter. His journey hadn't just been about academics. It was about reclaiming his identity, proving to himself and others that he was more than his past. Final thoughts. Matthew Cole's story is a powerful reminder that resilience and dignity can change even the most unyielding hearts. His journey was not just one of education, but one of self-discovery and growth. If his story inspired you, we invite you to like, comment, and share it with those who may need a reminder that it's never too late to start over. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and soul. Until next time.